Scientology could be called, well, you could call it a religion of religions.
And he says the monks had voices that sounded like bullfrogs. That's his whole observation about studying the mysteries of the East. He's a con man. There's no need to weave stories around it. The documents exist which prove he was a con man.
But with the agent theory, though, they will hire con men to do stuff for them.
No, they'll hire con men to do hits, but they sure as hell won't hire them as agents, because a psychopath, it's like the notion that you use psychopaths as soldiers. No, they'll frag their officers. You know, they won't follow orders. They'll do what they want to do. So no. Occasionally con men will get into such organizations, but you know, it's a pretty slim idea, isn't it? Because he was a con man, they might have hired him. The only route he had to intelligence, which we talked about before, was Robert Heinlein. And Heinlein did have top security clearance. So actually did Jack Parsons.
So what was he doing then? Because he was just a sci-fi author. So what intelligence activities was he doing?
Oh, he was a high-ranking Navy officer, and because of his scientific background, he had clearance. And
what was he doing though? Like
I don't know. I know that he had clearance, and that's the only reason that I can think of. The first and rarely talked about, mind control operation put forward by the US government was in the US Navy, and it was called Operation Bluebird. And it may well be that Heinlein mentioned this to Hubbard, but Hubbard doesn't seem to know any details of it. He talks about pain drug hypnosis being used. And by the way, the only attempt that Hubbard made to verify his engram theory, there's a report of that issued by the Los Angeles Foundation, the original foundation. I have copies of it. And Hubbard says, we used pain drug hypnosis on somebody, but they were unable to recover the engram. And that was the only scientific test that Hubbard ever tried in all of the years of Scientology.
Do you think Heinlein was maybe writing sci-fi that had like a pro-Navy slant or something like that, and it was a bit of pro-Navy propaganda or anything? Or
I think he was just a remarkable creative man. I don't particularly like his fiction, but Stranger in a Strange Land is a very interesting book. And he was a close friend of Hubbard's. They got on well, and I think it was Caroline Letkerman had access to Heinlein's journals, where Heinlein said that Hubbard had had sex both with Heinlein's wife and with Heinlein himself.
Is Heinlein known as being a closet gay or anything?
Nope. I know nothing about him.
Do you think it might have been a cult, a Crowley cult follower or something, some sort of sex magic or something?
I know nothing to that effect. But I believe that, whoever wants to do the next lot of research, I'm done. I found enough to prove that A, Scientology doesn't work except as Hubbard wanted it to work, to enslave people, and B, that Hubbard was severely psychiatrically ill. So I personally wouldn't follow anything he'd said. And looking at his research, things like the Purification Rundown or LSD years after they've come off LSD, or the Introspection Rundown, they're pathetic. The man was no scientist. He was no psychologist. He was just out to enslave people and abuse them for his amusement. And that continues, with under David Miscavige's rule.
I was listening to something about the Illuminati, or like some sort of cult, and what they did as a practice was that they would intentionally do outrageous things. So they would violate the God's commandments, like 10 commandments or whatever, and it's part of being like, I don't know, a Satanist or something. So they would engage in outrageous behavior and like sex with kids and stuff like that, because it was like a religious practice, basically, of I'm rebelling against the evil God, because they believed that the Old Testament God was evil, and it was like enforcing that. And it kind of made me think of, if Hubbard did do some of that molestation stuff we spoke about, it made me think this could be Hubbard's justification for it. Is that it's literally like a spiritual practice for him. It's him saying, I'm being absolutely outrageous. I'm going totally against God. I'm breaking free of that. And then he does that weird act. I just thought of that.
Sure. I mean, historically, there are different paths to illumination. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras of about 500 AD talks about 5 paths to achieving the siddhis, the magical powers. And one of those paths is mysticism, which is the path of truth, where you try to understand the world and what happens in it. Meditation can be a form of that, so that you learn how to concentrate your attention and understand things. This is commonly known as the right-hand path, the Dexter path. Then you have the magical path. The magical path, or sinister, meaning left, the sinister path, is that you develop your own power. And Hubbard would have taken this not from the Illuminati. The Illuminati is a very interesting subject all of itself. That they were basically a group who called themselves the Discordians in the early 1970s, decided to invent a conspiracy theory that nobody could possibly believe. And they found out about the Bavarian Illuminati, a group that only lasted for a few years, in fact. And they decided nobody will believe this nonsense. And now it's the essential conspiracy theory. So it's not the Illuminati, but it's Crowley. That to become powerful, you must overcome morality. You must do things that, and you will somehow obtain more and more magical power. Of course, in Aleister Crowley's case, he died as a decrepit, squalid heroin addict, so it didn't work too well for him. And as yet, nobody from his following, and he died, in 47, I think. No, none of his followers has actually taken over the world, and the B666 hasn't arrived, and we all seem to be okay. But yes, there is this idea that the magical path is developed by rebelling against everything that's moral. And that's not to be confused with, followers of, say, people like William Blake, who believe that Jehovah was evil. These are people who want to themselves become evil and want to have power. I have no doubt that Hubbard was, and we touched on this before, but that Hubbard was trying to create a following. That there's a strange scale that it was in Hubbard's private papers from the 40s, and he talks about laborers and workers being at the bottom of the scale, and the fool being at the top of the scale. Now, there is a lecture in the Philadelphia Doctorate course where he talks about the fool. And this is a card in the tarot pack. And he says the fool has an alligator barking at his heels. Well, in most packs, it's a dog. But in the Crowley pack, which is described in the Book of Thoth, it's an alligator. And Hubbard says the fool is, nothing affects the fool. Everything just goes straight through the fool. The fool is a living God. And he is putting forward the idea that the aim of Scientology is to achieve this. And then he drops the idea. It's the only mention ever of this idea that I'm aware of.
So the fool, that almost makes me think a bit of Hubbard, like this outrageous sort of crazy, but what he appears to be a silly fool, but he's doing these cunning, shifty things or something.
Yeah, or maybe he is actually a fool. But when you read Crowley's description of the fool is the wise man. And this is a Shakespearean idea that the fool always, in a Shakespeare play, is the guy that says the clever stuff. And he gets away with it because he's a jester. He's playing with things. Hubbard sees the fool as the magus, as the magician. And his whole aim was to achieve supernatural power.
Oh, sorry. So what if fool, this is where it's interesting. What if fool is fooling others? It's not him that's being the fool. He's conning others. So it's like, that's the trick. He's fooling others. He's a prankster.
Yeah, exactly. He's a prankster. He's Loki in the Viking mythology, coyote in the American Indian, hare in the African stories. This is the really clever, cunning. He's a fox. He's vulpine. And this is Hubbard. This is what he seeks to be. And so it didn't work. He lived a miserable life. He was sick most of his life. He had terror stomach, which he talks about in the 50s. He couldn't develop friendships with people. He didn't like his own children. He rejected his own wife. He was sexually impotent. Is this the man you want to imitate? You know, because that's all Scientology is. It's the externalization of that mind. And by following it, you can become just like Ron. I wouldn't recommend it. I really wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah,
so
it makes me think of the did you hear about the Strange Angel TV series? It was run for just 2 seasons.
No.
I really recommend it because I loved it, but it was about Jack Parsons and the OTO and rocket science and like World War II, and it was so cool. It was I really enjoyed it. It just got better and better. And then Hubbard came into the story. He knocked on the door, and then you just see him for 10 seconds, and then that's it. The whole series ended, and I was just like,
oh, no.
It was concerning. I was just like, this was a great series, but I think that you would really like it because there's a scene. Crowley's involved in it, right? And man, when Crowley comes into it, oh, it is so funny. Yeah.
Of course, again, there's source material. The Babylon Working, you can find it. Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword is the book that Jack Parsons wrote about his experiences with Hubbard. You can get hold of the Florida court documents where Parsons sued Hubbard. There are letters, there are all sorts of things, but I think probably we've come to a reasonable point of conclusion. I just wanted to make it clear that I'm available to talk on any subject, and I'm not part of the cancel culture because somebody disagrees with me. I'm not going to shun them. That was very much Hubbard's way, you know, that if you disagree with Hubbard, then you're a suppressive person and he can disconnect from you. I think that's cowardly. And let me make it very clear. I am most certainly not a misogynist. I haven't got the idea that you are. I think you're complaining that ultrafeminism may be painting a bleak picture of men. And I agree with you that does happen, spare rib feminism.